Hello.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Economy of Francesco School special lecture. Here is Paolo Santori speaking, and I will introduce and moderate this session. As you know, we divided the school in two parts. So there are some lectures organized by the Economy of Francesco villages about topics relating to Economy of Francesco principles and their applications in theory and practice. But also there are lectures like the one of today, when we invite a guest speaker to give a talk on a topic that might broaden our horizons. Also, I would say push up us of our disciplinary boundaries and comfort zones. And today we invited Professor John Milbank, who is an emeritus professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham. And before giving him the word, we have Professor Luigino Bruni, the scientific coordinator of the Economy of Francesco, that will say some words to greet and introduce Professor Milbank.
Yes, I'm very happy to have the chance to introduce Professor Milbank, John Milbank, because Professor Milbank is one of the leading figures in contemporary theology and philosophy. I met him about 10 years ago when we organized at Sofia University international conference on charismatic principles in economic and social life. Then I immediately realized that there was an unpredictable, unusual convergence between his theology and our approach to civil economy and economy of communion, and now I would say also economy of Francesco, because he was working in his research projects on modern, postmodern theology, also the importance of the virtue ethics, all the important issues that you can find in his books and papers. And then I immediately realized that John should become one of our allies in this journey of new foundations of economic and social theories from a theologian point of view and philosophical theologian, anthropological, I would say, point of view. And then we remain in touch for up to now. Working together. We also edited together a special issue of International Review of Economics on the Martin Luther heritage in modern social sciences. And John is working on very relevant issues for our school, for our economy of Francesco, as you will see immediately. Then I'm just concluding this very short introduction saying that this capital beyond capital is the idea of this year school is that we have to imagine that the capital as economics intends it, then the capital, monetary, material capital, today is not enough for our society. We know social capital, we know cultural capital, we know environmental capital, yes, but we need also spiritual capital, and as a new capital for living, for well-being, well-living of our society. Then this year we are working on this form, so new spiritual capital in our society. and there is no better person than John Milbank for introducing it from his perspective, as you will see, to this issue of spirituality as also a form of common good. And then I'm very happy that also the academy that you are here, this new year of our academy, EOF Academy, this 46 young PhD postdoc scholars all over the world that they are working with us on the economy of Francesco. And this is the first lecture for the new year of the Academy. And then I think is the best way to start this new year. Thank you, John. I don't know, Paolo, you have to, you want to say some other stuff, some other words, or we can start, we can go to John.
Just a quick reminder on the structure of this lecture. So Professor Milbank now will give a talk. Then we will have a Q&A in which the people from EOF Academy will have the chance to ask questions to Professor Milbank, but also on YouTube. If you have questions, if you have comments, please write it down, because then our staff will report it here and we will try to have a moment of Q&A. We will stay in 1 hour. So for me, now I hand the floor to Professor Milbank. The title of his talk is Money, Matter and Personhood. So Professor Milbank, thanks a lot for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you. And a special thanks to Luigino for that generous introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be connecting with your work in the economy of Francesco, and to link once again with the remarkable tradition of Italian civil economy, which has influenced me a lot. So, the modern market economy, as has been stressed ever since the physiocrats, consists of capital on the one hand and flows on the other. With seeming contradiction, it must constantly increase its static storage through accumulation, and yet this very accumulation is threatened with seizure and erosion if it is not constantly released, risked, and dynamized. Thus, capitalism is represented at once by the privileged economic enclave, like the City of London, where the normal writ of state scarcely runs, on real physical and bounded sites, and also by the endless circulation of global transport, at once real and virtual, that never ceases day or night. And of course, the solid site and the uprooted or abstract currents are intimately connected. The flow requires the hubs, but the flows alone ensure the power and the permanence of the hubs, just as castles housed troops in the medieval past. But the very security of the castles depended on their occasional or even continuous forays. In what does capital consist? First of all, in the primitive ownership of terrain and equipment that in modernity has become more outright and absolute, because it's been decoupled from the relationship between people that threatens to delimit ownership through a set of conditional obligations. Secondly, it consists in the ownership of money in however abstracted a form, such as shares and dividends. Thirdly, it consists in what is effectively the ownership of people, even though today slavery has been commuted to various modes of wage and salary dependency, supplemented by welfare. For the vast majority of people who own scarcely any assets or resources of their own that they might fall back upon. In effect, people themselves have in this way been capitalized. They are no longer treated mainly as spiritual creatures nor as citizens. The question of the fulfillment of their souls or their political participation has been relentlessly subordinated to their capacity as economic resources. In effect, they have been already robotized. They're treated as themselves equipment to be stored in territories of housing which they own, if at all, only precariously. The second two modes of capital, which are money and people, have to be put into continuous circulation and operation if further capital is to be accumulated and its existing citadels secured. To some degree, even the first mode of land must also be dynamized. Equipment can be transported and land ownership can change hands, while land itself can be ceaselessly mined, built upon, or deployed as various sorts of launch pad. Nonetheless, sheer locatability is curiously one key ingredient within the capitalist order, since it ultimately depends upon pure possession with no strings attached. It has to have an absolute nominalist power to name and to rename, and most of all to name identifiable places as its own. For this reason, one side of capital's development is always to do with a reduction of naturally symbolic reality, the place with which we associate traditions and memories, to sheer materiality or to pure Cartesian space. In this sense, capitalism concretizes, but only by rendering the concrete ever more abstract and therefore more modifiable and sometimes transferable. The other side of capitalist development is a much more dissolving mode of abstraction, whereby, as Marx said, all that is solid melts into air. It is here that capitalist money and capitalist people enters into the picture, and it is just here that absolute storage paradoxically coincides with absolute circulation. Exactly like the way in which my saving of this present lecture on Dropbox ensures that it's now available in principle for everyone, and for the prying eyes of various modes of global surveillance, it's available already. Thus, equivalently, money that is saved needs to be money that is invested, else it will diminish and be lost. People that are in effect owned have to be constantly retrained and redeployed and moved elsewhere if they are to be of any value or use, and not to escape from capitalist control after all. We need perhaps to remember that most migration happens for rather bad and essentially economic reasons. It follows that money and people are particularly important linkages between capital and flow, upon which the operation of the capitalist market economy depends. Without them, there could be no activation and no growth in wealth or profit. But what about things, which were the third element in the Roman law triad of people, things, and actions? Is not a market economy also to do with the production and exchange of things, which are commodities? And is not capitalism's ownership and exploitation of people to do with its operation of a distinct attitude towards the relationship of people to things? Instead of people producing and exchanging things for their use value, as Karl Marx put it, or equally for their symbolic and cultural value, we might want to add, they're now encouraged to produce things as laborers and to buy things as consumers only for their exchange value, reduced to a market monetary equivalence. This abstract value would seem to be established by paying all workers less than the full contribution of their labor in order to extract a profit, and by charging consumers more than the reasonable price of a commodity in terms permitted by its artificially contrived scarcity, or else its supposed desirability in terms of fashion and public spectacle. Think of the ludicrous prices charged for bottles of colored water, which are called perfumes or scents. But is monetary value established only in this sort of way? Should we see people as diverted from their natural lens of physical enjoyment, artistry, personal relating, and religious contemplation only or mainly by the operation of the process of the expropriation of their labor? The possible problem with this solely Marxist perspective is that it still regards money, along with the classical economists, as an essentially neutral mirror, a merely convenient mode of exchange which is secondary to the purposes of the supposedly real economy, which is the production and exchange of things. Even if these things have been perverted into the mode of commodities valued only for their comparative value in relation to each other. Marx indeed denied that economic value arises naturally from the interplay of supply with demand, or from what would later be called marginal utility. And he asserted instead that the price of a thing always disguises a coercive social relationship. And yet, he still saw money as but a neutral representation of value generated by labor. And accordingly, he referred money to commodification rather than commodification to money. Of course, the two things are mutually implicated. Commodification demands the measure of money, and money as a medium of exchange itself gets, in a capitalist system, unnaturally commodified, as do also both land and people, as Karl Polanyi averred. But is capitalist money primarily a commodity, and is it primarily a medium of exchange? That's the really crucial question. And at this juncture, it has been argued by a minority in the sociological and the Keynesian traditions, picking up upon neglected earlier 18th century theorists, that money is at least as much a unit of account as it is a measure of exchange. What does unit of account mean? By this, it's meant that before or besides money being representative of the value of a thing, it's also the attribution of a certain abstract number to people that is always at base a register of a credit and debt relationship between people, and a register of unequal power, and ultimately of a different mode of social coercion from the one described by Marx. In other words, if I own 1,000 euros, that's not primarily because that represents so many goods, as it's 1,000 euros of credit that society or the social relations I happen to be in have allowed me to have. On this account of things, the conversion of people into capital and away from their natural and real personhood is not only to do with the exploitation of their labor as workers or of their desires as consumers. It's also to do with the degree to which they tend to become themselves mere docketed numbers, understood in terms of how much money they have, considered directly in relation not to productive capital, but to finance capital, as a source of borrowing and lending. Whereas workers and consumers remain fully people, even though their creativity and desire for things is being subordinated to the extrinsic ends of the market. In this case, in the case of people reduced to numbers, even as individual living creatures, they are being entirely quantified. They are simply identified with their wealth, with their credit, or else with their poverty, their degree of indebtedness. Now, of course, to begin with, in the industrial and then in the later consumerist phases of capitalist development, exploitation via the productive economy was much more to the fore for most people than exploitation by the financial economy. The more direct reduction to quantity, whereby people become essentially and mainly creditors and debtors, applied only to a minority. And most of that minority were themselves rich or relatively rich. And yet, in our contemporary digital phase of capitalist development, more and more people are being sucked into this credit-debt nexus on an ever more microscopic as well as macroscopic basis. Moreover, the fact that financial depersonalization applied at first more to elites or to the relatively prosperous doesn't render it any less significant for comprehending the nature of a capitalist economy. It is only and ironically within the perspective of a too classical economic outlook that Marx assumed the primacy of production over finance. However, the extraction of surplus value and surplus desire, and I think we should accept that Marx is right about those things, do not fully account for the prior requirement of capitalism, both to expropriate land and resources, which Marx, of course, did partially take into account, nor for speculative investment by banks, which can alone drive forward the technological innovation upon which it depends. Arguably, the conversion of mainly rural into wage labor was already achieved in England before anywhere else in the early modern period. But this was not enough to establish a full-scale capitalist economy driven by the pure search for abstract wealth. For that, one needed what one might call a shift at the top rather than a shift at the bottom. And in this respect, socialists have been rather misguided if they too much follow their instinctive aversion to following the behavior of elites. This shift at the top involved in England the arrival of a complex relationship between extended state debt, private banks, the productive taxpayer, and the mediation of the Central Bank of England. Basically, banks now began to create money out of nothing by offering speculative loans for which they had no secure guaranteed deposits, such that debts themselves in the long run generated credits, so long as these ventures were backed up by a central bank, the debt of the crown, and that itself by burgeoning tax returns, which the very success of this unprecedentedly speculative investment ensured. So it's a remarkable fact that the successively two most powerful nations in the modern period, first of all, the United Kingdom and then the United States, have both been by far the most indebted nations. In other words, debt translates directly into power. And it's perhaps this core of capitalism that is much more political that bizarrely enough, Karl Marx didn't take full enough account of. In this fashion, a new sort of credit money was born, and eventually all our money, and even coinage, which, you know, is vanishing every day. Who uses coins anymore? They don't even in my village somewhere north of the Trent in England. All our money eventually has become credit money. Fundamentally, we just flash our credit card and we get a cup of coffee or a house or something, you know. Fundamentally, our money today is not a matter of equivalence to goods, but of the numbers we are assigned, as if we're in a children's game, the numbers we are allowed to have, and which represent implicit demands that we can make upon others and that others can make upon us. Now, it would be easy to assume in historical terms that all this, the way we do things now, is simply an aberration. Well, to a degree, it is an aberration, and I'll talk about that first. For example, just this dominance of credit money was what drove and made possible the European overseas empires, which were rather unprecedented in their character. They imposed taxation on previously existing subsistence economies, which had to be paid in terms of money. And so that required the growth of wage labor to ensure that people had the money to pay the taxes. Once again, then we can see here how modern credit money is as much a political as it is an economic invention, and is inherently linked to modern absolute state sovereignty, which has ruthlessly executed local counterfeiters, and sometimes indeed it has branded with red-hot coins tax defaulters. We can also see how this mode of financial depersonalization, as I want to call it, is just as much to do with coercive social relations as is the creation of exchange value. Again, you'd have thought Marx would have been alert to that, but he actually wasn't. The state, the central bank, and private rentier all coerce and constrain each other in a sort of vicious triangle. And all three together put enormous pressure on the combined producer come worker class further to enclose, invest, automate, render labor more efficient, work all hours of the day and night, etc. From this, one can see how the contest and tension between finance capital on the one hand and productive capitalism on the other may be at least as constitutive of capitalism as such as is the tension between capitalist and worker. In other words, capitalism always has a choice. It has two channels it can go down, the production channel or the finance channel, and it tends to oscillate between the two. Now, incidentally, this is just a thought. This may explain why populism is not a sort of unnatural aberration compared with class struggle, as the political left often seems to assume. Because populism may be rather precisely the assertion of an alliance between especially petty producers plus workers against the elite financiers. In other words, a conflict between production and finance rather than the worker capitalist conflict. Most classically, this was enacted by the Peronist regime in Argentina, Pope Francesco's home country, that was ironically undone by the export of the residual Argentinian finance abroad, subsequent compensatory state printing of money, and then consequent catastrophic runaway inflation. But that was an attempt, if you like, at a pure populist productive regime. And it came to grief probably because capitalism is inherently, in part, constituted by finance. And if you don't have efficient kind of banking mediating between the state and production, it's not going to work. And something is probably true of a lot of African regimes that are essentially patrimonial regimes. And that's partly why they rely on foreign bankers and get exploited by them. However, there are reasons to see the finance axis as actually more fundamental to capitalism than the production axis, something fascinatingly intimated by none other than Edmund Burke, whose excoriation of the revolutionary emergent French credit regime was clearly revisionary in relation to the most standard Whig support for just such a regime in the case of England. So the late Romantic Burke, who's criticizing the French Revolution, is essentially beginning to have new thoughts about the nature of capitalism and the problems about capitalism, something that the usual conservative readers of Burke tend to overlook. First of all, we have already seen how the invention of money you have not actually got via the making of loans was essential to productive investment and capitalist takeoff. Secondly, the pursuit of wealth for its own sake surely has its origins in the pure trading of money as credit and debt. And it's only the subordination of production to finance from the very outset which requires a firm to pursue only shareholder value, no longer to make things in part for the sake of making things, or to reward workers in part for the intrinsic value of their labor, and to make them to some degree partners in the enterprise. After all, it's only very recently that firms have started to pursue shareholder value alone and thereby become purely capitalistic. I remember a British politician saying his father was a toy manufacturer because he was still a child and still loved toys. Nobody any longer makes toys for that reason any longer. It follows that however much we may deplore the degradation of the person as worker and the degradation of the use of things as a consumer, that all the same, these depersonalizations do not have their most direct origin in the capital versus labor class struggle. However real that struggle may be at its own level. To the contrary, our more fundamental diagnosis of capitalism should be of a more spiritualist and a less materialist kind, just because this is more fundamentally real, because we are spiritual as well as material creatures. So just as both Christianity and Islam have alike often suggested, the more fundamental structuring of capitalism is that of usury, not understood simply as the unnatural attempt to gain from a mere medium of exchange, as denounced by Aristotle, but also the binding of people to other people in terms of abstract relations of obligation that are nothing to do with personal relationship or any substantive, real, mutual service, honoring, recognition, and protection. Instead, the usurious relationships involved in credit money, which is now all of our money all of the time, imply that some people have a purely abstract and numerical control over others. Abstract, yes, but remembering that capitalism has to secure sites reduced to sheer physicality, just as much as it has to render things abstract, we have to realize that the ultimate security of credit relationships is imprisonment, banishment, and death. Yet there is a significant complication which relates to this idea that usury is as much a distortion of personal relationships as it is an unnatural mode of commodification of a mere means of exchange. For if, as we have suggested, money is not just that, not just a means of exchange, but is equally or more a mode of abstract accounting, of assigning credit or debt, then it may be that modern money as credit money, although certainly aberrational, is yet not quite such an aberration as we might think, or not in the mode that we might think. For the upshot of the researches of sociologists like Simmel or Weber, besides Keynesians in Cambridge, France, and Italy, is that money as a social relationship historically preceded money in universal coinage. Paradoxical as it may seem, money is older than coins. Classical economists like Adam Smith assume that money was but a convenient abbreviation of barter. However, the historical evidence indicates that monetary valuation arose instead in the context of ancient Near East command economies, which involved the mass collection and redistribution of economic resources and the consequent systematic calculation of indebtedness, often still religiously linked to sacrificial obligations. Amounts of silver, for example, might be held to be equivalent to so many grains or heads of barley. It was this ratio, and not a coin, that was represented by a shekel. Coinage arose later in the context of the disintegration of empires and the dispersal into several different centers of authority, something that was much more drastically repeated with the later fall of Rome. Medieval coinage became more abstract and universal, where earlier minting had still been carried out by tribal gentes, and coins still recorded relatively personal and specific obligations, something that survives now only in the form of the stamped head of the monarch, of King Charles III, for example, on new British and other coins. Consequently, it seems that money is always more the mark of credit and debt, if originally of much more local, specific, and non-tradable kinds of credit and debt. However, this Weberian perspective, and let's remember that Weber was very Nietzschean, appears to suggest that all money is at best a truce, and that money only arises at all out of a kind of suspended agonism, which modernity has vastly accentuated. If money is not a commodity and not a neutral representation of other commodities, then it is not really, save for fond illusion, the site of an agreed representation of shared values, ultimately linked to both utilitarian and ethical values. The most that might be socially hoped for from this Weberian point of view on money would be some sort of balance between the financial and productive forces of capitalism besides the factors of ownership and labor. Perhaps indeed we need that sort of corporatist compromise once again nowadays. But if argon, if struggle is fundamental, then how can that sort of compromise ever possibly be a stable and sustainable one? Rather, one could venture that if, as has been argued, it is finance that is always capitalism's leading edge, then given our resignation to a capitalist order, there is nothing accidental or even in capitalist terms realistically reversible about the increased financialization of the economy in our own day. The weakening of production, the turn to rentiership over land as a prime source of income, even the slowing of profits are not, on this view, to be taken as signs of capitalist weakening or even of capitalist crisis, since capitalism has never as such been interested in the growth of physical wealth or technological innovation for their own sake. To the contrary, if capitalism now appears to be quasi-feudal and increasingly to do with the vectoral extraction of surplus information as much as the extraction of surplus labor, in a digital fusing of the financial with the productive, then that's just because from the English Whig outset, capitalism was mainly to do with the building up of the most abstract form of capital and the maintaining of the power of a political come banking elite class over everyone else. In this regard, the increasing dominance of a tiny global elite in our own day, which is intent upon the ever greater consolidation and monopolization of power, that's not a capitalist anomaly either. This is just, if you like, late capitalism as ultra capitalism, as a purer and purer mode of capitalism, however depressing this might seem. So, if money was primordially indebtedness, then it would seem that human personhood is doomed. However, for all their denial of economic ahistoricism, the proponents of the Keynesian, what I'd want to call the Cambridge view of money, the great numismaticist Philip Grierson, the sociologist Jeffrey Ingham, in some ways they can sound just like Weber himself, who saw capitalism as rational and normative, as still too close to this sort of ahistoricism for all their protests. This is surely inevitable if one discounts the possibility that ancient credit and debt relations were more than arbitrary ones of power, but that they truly embodied, however imperfectly, humanly shared and exchanged ethical values of mutual honoring and service. In other words, that they had a kind of gift exchange dimension, which seems to be what the Cambridge School rather peculiarly leaves out of question. Even from an objective historical point of view, too little is made of the clear truth that such arrangements within command economies were definitely mutations of gift exchange in a more hierarchical mode, rather than the total abandonment of primitive gift exchange. Still more seriously, these proponents of money as unit of account still, like their classical opponents, seem to assume that earlier purely reciprocal tribal economies were barter economies rather than economies of the gift, as Marcel Mauss argued. So they seem to be kind of out of date in still thinking in terms of primitive barter economy. If one does bring in the gift perspective, then it would seem that the nodal debates as to the nature of money, primarily is money a commodity or is it a numerical account, can in fact be mediated. Unlike the bartered object, the gift is in itself at once a thing and a symbolic value, and also a stand-in for the giving persons. Sorry.
It's gone.
Can you hear me? Sorry. To such a degree that a gift is a quasi-person, just as persons reciprocally can be seen as exchangeable gifts, as in the case of the exchange of marriage partners. As Mose argued in a long footnote in The Gift, money as equivalent object, for example, in the form of shells or beads or rugs and so on, substitutable for other gifts, arises in this context such that while indeed it is a kind of representative commodity and a measure of exchange, money also, this primitive money, like all other gifts, is a recorder of credit and debt, even though in this cultural context, a debt has to a degree a positive and a binding characteristic. Debts are not so much things you avoid as things that you can embrace. So the argument would be that if we look at things in a Mosian way, it becomes possible to see money as simultaneously a means of exchange and a kind of commodity, as well as it being a record of value and a conveyor of credit and debt. In other words, all those usual theoretical alternatives start to collapse together if you see money as a particularly symbolic or sacred gift, like the cowrie shells in the Pacific. So this very early token money was not fixed in value and universally usable in any context whatsoever, like later coinage. And yet, and this is really, really crucial to the argument, in other respects, this early token money curiously anticipated money as credit, and even money as credit in its most modern and radical aspects. As the American poet Lewis Hyde emphasized, a gift is fundamentally poetic or creative. In giving, one creates a relationship which one does not already have. If you give a gesture, you're giving something that you didn't have to begin with, for example. And by giving something away in a gift exchange context, one increases one's power. In this manner, gift exchange is curiously akin to a modern bank inventing money by offering credit from resources it doesn't really possess. Moreover, a gift in general, and especially token gifts, were inherently usurious, in scare quotes. They were in some ways a mode of usury. Thus, through circulation, a gift increased in its value, and some of that increase had to return to the original giver, though not all of it, as in the case of modern usury. The increase itself could be further increased by a further passing on. The ancient world really gave good things in order to achieve honor and prestige. The modern banker can only achieve that honor and prestige, well, at least prestige, if not honor, through eventual repossession and foreclosure. For a long time, in Latin, the word usura meant still this positive way in which things can increase in their value through use, both real use and symbolic use. The gift of barley seed grows into a bushel. The ancestral bridal ring acquires a non-tradable meaning. For this reason, the giver or seller of the seed was legitimately entitled to a later share of the harvest. But as we move into the medieval period, for various reasons, a trade in money, a usurious trade, becomes acceptable, even though it continued to be condemned both by the church and by Islamic authorities. Within the perspective of the gift, we can see how usury as sin can be regarded in a double way. It can be seen both in Aristotelian or Thomist terms as the unnatural attempt to use something that can't be used up, like food or clothing. And it can also be seen as the illegitimate attempt by perhaps otherwise impotent people to gain a total hold over someone else, like Shylock in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, fully allowing that one has to, of course, withdraw from total Christian hypocrisy and mistreatment of the Jewish people in this regard. Maslow's thought that the triple gift obligation to give, receive, and give again constituted the total social fact that no society can exist without. If he is right about that, then this confronts us with the conundrum that what modernity has most of all done is exit the gift, remove itself from gift exchange. And yet, if Marx is right, no society can possibly exit the gift and remain a society. But most surely is right in his definition. In the end, society is mutual obligation or mutual recognition, as Hegel and then Antonio Rosmini put it in the 19th century, in the Italian tradition of civil economy, which has never fully allowed the Anglo-Saxon of divorce of the economic from social duty and interpersonal solidarity. In that case, our usurious and financialized late capitalism is still, after all, somehow within the total social fact, albeit it is a kind of parody of that fact. Its reduction of money to pure credit returns it in a perverse way more clearly to money as a matter of interhuman power relations. Its insertion of debt into all aspects of life binds us more and more together to other and remote persons, albeit again in an impersonal and seemingly perverse manner. Capitalism's increasing invention of money as fiat money promotes once more, albeit perversely, the human truth that we endlessly create meanings and new things seemingly out of thin air in what we might take to be our participation in the creativity of God ex nihilo. The question for us today then becomes, can we sustain the social fact in this parodic mode forever and yet remain truly human persons? Most of us are now being pacified. Our creativity and our will to participate in social processes is being eroded. We're becoming couch potatoes in front of screens, confined to home, like me at this very moment. But can this situation truly be secure against an eventual populist protest of the majority, whose material well-being is also becoming more and more precarious? What is more, I think there's a genuine dialectic at work here, deeper than the one envisaged by Marx. The more everything becomes abstract and capitalized, then the more the positive and finite sources of previous power are abandoned. in a sense, this returns us to primal and anarchic origins. It returns us to infinite possibilities. It returns us to raw power relations, less mediated by material production, and to a greater immediacy of transaction, as in the case of digital currencies. Even if these really do remain money on the Cambridge definition, and their debt accumulations can still be capitalized by banks, who are rather unlikely to disappear, despite what some people think. There is no inevitable good synthesis to come at the end of this dialectic, as once again Marx supposed. Things can go on getting darker, even if it puts human people and the planet in peril. Much land may become uninhabitable, and most people may lose their capacities for volere, nascere, and potere, or willing, knowing, and empowering, of which was spoken of by Tommaso Campanella in the 16th century, and then the Italian civil economists after him, all, of course, ultimately in the wake of St. Augustine. The ending of the gold standard and the depletion of finite resources today often encourages the globalization of both finance and various attempts at ecological and biopolitical control. And yet, conversely, it was exactly exiting the global gold standard which precisely allowed the New Deal to come into being, along with the Keynesian era as a whole, which was very much linked to the view that the state can create money from nothing and then link it to social and national benefit, albeit within mutually international protective arrangements, as with Bretton Woods, something that national populists tend to forget, but that Joe Biden may be now trying to revive. He realizes that if you have an American national industrial policy, you probably have to link it to other industrial policies elsewhere if international finance is not going to undermine what you're trying to do. Thus, rediscovering the seemingly arbitrary and infinitely expandable value of money, although this always requires a reciprocal and joint expansion if it's going to work, as Keynes pointed out, and Argentina unfortunately ignored that point. But this infinitely expandable value of money can be taken in a positive direction. It is not at root nominalistic if monetary value can be newly interfused with real social and ethical value. The new immediacy of internet transactions could be similarly returned to a more integral social, besides economic, reciprocal engagement between people, which can be an engagement in real local time if we also conform to the principle of subsidiarity. Finally, the increasing dominance of debt-credit relationships, unmoored from directly productive aims, can potentially be reinfused through a new sort of socio-political action yet to be invented, with a new sense of a gift usury rather than a monetary usury. Of course, that would require not just a chain of real personal recognitions in both virtual and real time, but also a bending back, after all, to a new sort of production, such that all lending is real investment in real processes that are physical, cultural, and personal, delivering real use and symbolic value. In the end, this requires the substitution of human creative art or poetry for the parody of that creativity of the gift, which is the monetary economy, as Ezra Pound realized and Lewis Hyde has reiterated. Only our only real human capital is our subcreative power, and under God, this is infinite in scope. Our contemporary situation is not at all, as so many think, the rediscovery of inevitable limits, but to a degree it is just the opposite. We have abandoned any finitist idea that money needs limited gold as a measure. And we're gradually turning from finite and exhaustible sources of energy to renewable ones, and we will soon discover more, whose capacity is unrestricted and therefore potentially infinite. We are therefore moving ever more into the infinite and the unknown, not the opposite. Just as scarcity of goods or of natural resources is only something artificially contrived by the market or irresponsible use of technology. But this opening age of the infinite confronts us with a choice. It offers a new and frightening Faustian power for the elite, as Goethe indicated in part 2 of his great play, which concerns in part the creation of credit money in the 18th century. But it also offers us the possibility to escape from finite limits that have themselves been used by the powerful to constrain us, like the power of oil, for example, to escape from that towards the infinite human spiral of endless mutual recognition and mutual encouragement. And ultimately, it is only the infinite spiral and not the infinite line which can be forever sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Milbank. Was very interesting. Yeah, you're receiving the clap from the audience, also from YouTube. So I'm, yeah, it's 5. So actually,
Oh, sorry.
No, but that's me because I'm incapable of being a moderator. I mean, when I'm listening.
It's rather hard doing things at a distance.
Yeah, no, but it was engaging. Yeah. And the good news for the audience is also that Professor Milbank will share the text that of this article, not because we have the access to his Dropbox, but out of generosity, you know. So and
that's reassuring.
Yeah. That's So I will say this: can we gather 2 or 3 questions here on Zoom? I have a small moment of Q&A, and then we'll end. So who have questions for Professor Milbank on the basis of his talk? Can you raise the hand virtually? Okay, even so I see Michael, for example. Yes. So Michael, you can start, and then if there is someone, just keep it essential, right?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Milbank, for your lecture. My short but large question is: do you see the capitalism that you have described as an immanentization of Christianity, whereby original debt towards a creator, which has been paid by Christ, has now become immanentized by the kind of debt relations that you have described, especially by our debt relation towards the state as the new sovereign who has replaced God?
Yeah, that is a bit of a big question indeed. I mean, part of what I'm trying to say is that if one sees money purely as, or mainly as debt, rather than as a reciprocal gift binding us, then that is a very, very gloomy view, which tends to put the phenomenon of sacrifice as the prime way of kind of understanding human origins. Whereas this would be another argument, but I tend to think that gift is more primary than sacrifice, and that we should understand sacrifice as an instance of gift. And that gives you a rather more optimistic view that gift is kind of about binding us together and binding us to the gods. And that if you kind of owe somebody a return gift, like owing a dinner party back again, it's not really a burden, but it's actually a way of kind of linking us. But maybe, when religions turn sinister, there's more and more stress is put on sacrifice and debt. You can think of the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Incas, especially Aztecs, where it seems as if, a horrendous return of blood is required all the time. Now, I mean, the idea of Christianity is that that the debt that we owe for sin, which is something like our sort of suffering because we're evil, or making restitution because of what we've done wrong, has been fully realized by Christ, and we just have to now share in that. But Léon Blois, at the end of the 19th century, very interestingly, he stressed, first of all, that Jesus warns against the dangers of money, and that when he's talking about the repaying of debts, he's also talking about escaping from a very bad debt economy. He's not only talking at the ethical level, but also at that kind of economic level. And for Blois, it was supremely significant that Jesus was betrayed by being turned into money, for 30 pieces of silver. So that sort of Blois was inclined to suggest that, we're literally, the more we desert Christianity, the more we're enacting out what Judas did. We're changing God for money. That money has become our new God and our new idol, and therefore we're abandoning the liberation from our sins and for our debts for a regime of endless indebtedness again. So that thereby capitalism looks like a quasi religion, and sort of, just as I've been suggesting, maybe it's a kind of parody of gift exchange relationships. So also it could be viewed as a kind of parody of Christianity. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, on that note, I have people from the outside say, "Oh, we need to end," even if it's. I mean, I will.
No.
Yeah, I would have also questions myself, but anyway, I mean, let's say that we will collect, because I saw that there are also some questions on YouTube, more on spiritual capital. I will collect them, and then I will send to Professor Milbank, and if you send a reply, that will be together with the transcript of the talk. That would be very, very great. And
I'll get this all to you. Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Professor. Thanks for your time, for the opportunity of meeting you and listening and learning from you. I have two quick announcements. Next Friday, we will start the course on Franciscan economic thought, right? The course that is for the academy, and we will also touch some topics mentioned today: usury, money, value, this kind of. And next week, next Monday, we will have another lecture of the Economy of Francesco School, the one organized by villages. This time is the village Agriculture and Justice who are organizing this lecture. So if you want to attend, and you can attend, you are more than welcome. So thanks a lot to everyone, especially Professor Milbank. And I'll see you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks very much.
We have also the conclusive sigla.